Good evening, and welcome back to Midnight Whispers. Tonight, we explore Alaska, a land of icy silence and unforgiving landscapes, where ordinary people have faced extraordinary horrors that have left them scarred forever. Hunters stalked by unseen forces, pilots vanishing in the snow, and strange lights appearing under the northern lights are only a few of the verified true accounts you'll hear. These are not myths, they are chilling events drawn from first-hand experiences. Subscribe now and join our community of midnight listeners who seek truth in darkness. Take a deep breath, focus. Our first Alaskan story begins, plunging us into the frozen and terrifying unknown. Story 1. Alaska Triangle. Flight 727, I found the metal fragment buried 3 feet deep in permafrost that had been frozen solid for 53 years. The twisted aluminum bore serial numbers that matched Congressman Nick Begich's missing plane, the aircraft that vanished without a trace in 1972, spawning the legend of the Alaska Triangle. My name is Marcus Chen, and I am a glaciologist who spent the last decade studying climate change in remote Alaska. What I discovered last winter changed everything I thought I knew about science, reality, and the dark forces that govern the most isolated corners of our world. The official story says Flight 727 disappeared somewhere between Anchorage and Juneau on October 16, 1972. Congressman Begich, House Majority Leader Hale Boggs, aide Russell Brown, and pilot Don Johns simply vanished into the vast Alaskan wilderness. The largest search and rescue operation in Alaska's history found nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no emergency signals. 4 men and their twin-engine Cessna 310 had been swallowed by the triangle of wilderness between Anchorage, Barrow, and Juneau, a region where more people disappear per capita than anywhere else on Earth. But I know what really happened to them. The fragment appeared in my ice core samples near Portage Glacier, 40 miles southeast of Anchorage. The aluminum was embedded in ice that carbon dating confirmed had formed in late 1972. Impossible, according to geological timelines. Permafrost doesn't trap debris and then freeze solid in a matter of hours. Yet here was physical evidence that something catastrophic had happened exactly when and where the official investigation claimed nothing could be found. I should have reported the discovery immediately. Instead, I packed the fragment in my field kit and continued my research, driven by a curiosity that would soon become an obsession. The metal felt wrong in my hands, not just cold, but actively drawing heat from my skin like some kind of thermal vampire. When I examined it under magnification, I found microscopic etchings that looked almost like symbols, carved with impossible precision into the aircraft aluminum. That night in my research trailer, I dreamed of falling through endless gray sky while something vast and ancient watched from the clouds above. I woke with frostbite on my fingertips, despite the trailer's heating system running at full capacity. The fragment sat on my desk, covered in a thin layer of ice that had formed in a 70-degree room. I began researching the Alaska Triangle with the same methodical approach I used for climate data. The statistics were staggering. Since 1988, more than 16,000 people have vanished in Alaska, twice the national average. The Triangle region shows the highest concentration of disappearances, with entire search planes, hiking groups, and even military aircraft simply ceasing to exist. The official explanations blamed harsh weather, difficult terrain, and human error. But the patterns were too consistent, too geographically specific. Local indigenous communities had different stories. Elders spoke in hushed tones about the hungry sky and the place where the world becomes thin. They described areas where compasses spun wildly, where the aurora borealis appeared in impossible colors, and where travelers reported seeing cities in the clouds that vanished when approached. These weren't superstitions. They were warnings passed down through generations of people who understood the land better than any government investigation. I found Flight 727's actual flight plan buried in declassified FAA documents. The route took them directly over an area locals called the Silent Valley, a depression between 2 mountain ranges where radio signals died and aircraft instruments malfunctioned with disturbing regularity. Pilot Don Johns had filed a backup route specifically to avoid this area. Yet air traffic control recordings showed the plane deviating from the approved flight path just minutes before contact was lost. The recordings themselves were another mystery. I obtained copies through a Freedom of Information request and discovered something the official investigators had either missed or deliberately ignored. In the final transmission, beneath Don Johns' calm voice reporting routine altitude and heading, you could hear something else, a low-frequency hum that seemed to pulse in rhythm with human breathing. Sound analysis software showed the frequency was just below the range of conscious hearing, designed to trigger primal fear responses in the human brain. I drove to the coordinates where Flight 727, his last transmission, originated. The road ended at an abandoned mining camp from the 1940s. Its buildings collapsed under decades of snow and ice. But the silence there was absolute. No wind, no animal sounds, no insect noise. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing sound. My GPS unit malfunctioned within minutes, the screen flickering between my actual coordinates and impossible locations thousands of miles away. That is when I saw the other fragments. They were scattered across a quarter-mile radius, buried at varying depths in the permafrost. More pieces of Flight 727, but also debris from aircraft that had disappeared decades earlier and others that wouldn't, to crash for years to come. Serial numbers from a military transport that vanished in 1950. Engine parts from a bush plane that would disappear in 1995. Metal twisted by forces that exceeded any known aircraft accident, warped into shapes that hurt to look at directly. I realized I was standing in the center of something that existed outside normal time and space, a collection point where the Alaska Triangle deposited its victims across multiple decades simultaneously. The hungry sky wasn't just swallowing aircraft, it was storing them in some impossible dimension where past, present, and future collapsed into a single, terrifying moment. My research equipment began registering electromagnetic anomalies that peaked every 12 hours with clockwork precision. Radiation detectors showed spikes of particles that didn't match any known isotopes. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in minutes, then returned to normal without explanation. Reality itself was breaking down at the molecular level, creating gaps where our world touched something older and infinitely more dangerous. On my final night at the site, I found them. The bodies were perfectly preserved in the ice, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. Congressman Begich sat in his aircraft seat, his briefcase still clutched in his hands, staring upward at something that had filled him with such fear that his heart had stopped before the crash. Pilot Don Johns was frozen mid-scream, his controls twisted into impossible configurations, as if he had been trying to fly in directions that didn't exist in three-dimensional space. But they weren't alone. Dozens of other victims surrounded them, passengers from flights that had disappeared across 7 decades, all trapped in the same moment of cosmic horror. Their eyes reflected something I couldn't see but could feel pressing down from above, a presence so vast and alien that human minds simply shut down when confronted with its reality. I ran then, abandoning my equipment and research, driving through the night until I reached Anchorage. But the fragments followed me. They appeared in my hotel room, materialized in my luggage, manifested in my dreams. The hungry sky had marked me as its next victim, and I could feel it pulling at the edges of my consciousness, trying to drag me back to that place where time meant nothing and fear was the only constant. The Alaska Triangle ISN, just a region where people disappear. It is a wound in reality itself, a place where something that should never have touched our world has been feeding for centuries. Flight 727 didn't crash. It was harvested, along with its passengers, to sustain an entity that exists in the spaces between dimensions. I'm telling you this story because I can feel it calling again. The fragments have grown cold in my apartment, and frost forms on my windows despite the summer heat. My compass spins wildly, always pointing north toward that silent valley where past and future victims wait in eternal terror. If you flying over Alaska, avoid the triangle. If you see cities in the clouds, look away. If your instruments fail and you hear that low, breathing hum beneath the radio static, pray that your end comes quickly. Because some disappearances aren't accidents. They re-invitations to feed something that should have stayed in the dark between the stars. Story 2. Butcher Baker. Hunting grounds. I found the metal hunting tags buried 6 inches deep in the frozen ground. Rusted through but still readable. 27 numbered tags, each one corresponding to a missing person report filed between 1971 and 1983. The final tag bore the number 28, but no missing person report existed for that victim. Not yet. My name is David Kellerman, and I am a property surveyor who spent last summer mapping remote parcels of land north of Anchorage for a development company. What I discovered in those isolated clearings changed everything I thought I knew about evil, and why some places should stay buried forever. The official story says Robert Hansen was just a baker who killed 17 women in Alaska between 1971 and 1983. They called him the Butcher Baker, a quiet family man who hunted human beings like animals in the vast Alaskan wilderness, flying them to remote locations and releasing them with a head start before tracking them down with his hunting rifle. The FBI caught him, he confessed, and he died in prison in 2014. Case closed, but I know there were more victims. And I know something far worse than Hansen is still out there, using his hunting grounds for purposes that make serial murder look like childish play. The first red flag came when my GPS coordinates didn't match the property boundaries on the legal documents. The lot I was surveying was supposed to be 40 acres of uninhabited wilderness, but my equipment showed structures that shouldn't exist. Concrete foundations, cleared runways, and what appeared to be underground storage facilities. When I cross-referenced the coordinates with historical records, I discovered the land had been purchased by Robert Hansen in 1974, 3 years after his killing spree supposedly began. I should have reported the discrepancies and moved on. Instead, I decided to investigate the structures myself, driven by the same curiosity that would soon become a nightmare I can't escape. The first foundation I found was a concrete slab roughly 12 feet square, with metal anchor points embedded at regular intervals around the perimeter. Rust stains marked where chains had been attached, and the concrete was pitted with what looked like bullet holes. But the damage patterns were wrong. The impacts came from below, as if someone had been shooting up through the foundation from underneath. That is when I found the entrance to the underground complex. Hidden beneath a false floor of rotted plywood and camouflaged with decades of fallen leaves, a steel hatch opened onto a ladder that descended into absolute darkness. The air rising from below carried a smell I recognized but couldn't place, something organic and sweet, like meat left too long in a warm freezer. My flashlight beam revealed a tunnel system that extended far beyond what one man could have constructed alone. The walls were lined with photographs, hundreds of them, dating back to the early 1960s and continuing through the present day. Not just Hansen, his known victims, but dozens of other faces, men, women, and children who had never been reported missing. Each photograph was marked with a date, GPS coordinates, and a handwritten note describing the subject, his physical condition and psychological state. The most recent photos were dated less than 6 months ago. At the end of the main tunnel, I found Hansen's workshop. The room contained everything you'd expect from a serial killer's hideout: hunting equipment, restraints, weapons, and detailed topographic maps of Alaska marked with red X's indicating body disposal sites. But it also contained things that didn't fit the official narrative. Advanced communications equipment that wouldn't be invented until the 1990s. Medical instruments designed for procedures I didn't recognize. And most disturbing of all, shipping manifests for human cargo that continued years after Hansen's arrest and imprisonment. I photographed everything, but when I reviewed the images later, they showed empty rooms and blank walls. Whatever technology was operating in that underground complex, it actively resisted documentation. The only evidence I could retain were the metal hunting tags, which seemed to exist outside whatever field was scrambling my camera equipment. The manifests revealed the true scope of Hansen's operation. He wasn't just a lone serial killer. He was the Alaska coordinator for a network that spanned the entire Pacific Northwest. The organization called itself the Great Hunt, and it treated human beings like a renewable resource to be harvested, processed, and distributed to clients whose appetites went far beyond simple murder. Names and addresses filled dozens of ledger books. Judges, politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement officials from Seattle to Juneau. Payment records showing transactions in the millions of dollars for what was described as premium wilderness experiences. Flight logs detailing aircraft movements between remote airstrips that didn't appear on any official aviation charts. And most chilling of all, breeding schedules for human livestock maintained at facilities across Alaska, Washington, and British Columbia. I realized that Hansen's arrest and conviction had been orchestrated by the organization itself. He had become a liability, drawing too much attention to their operations. By allowing him to be caught and confessing to a limited number of murders, They had provided law enforcement with a satisfying conclusion while the real network continued operating in the shadows. The evidence suggested that Hansen's hunting grounds were still active, now managed by successors who had refined his methods with modern technology and expanded the operation into something approaching an industrial scale. Satellite imagery showed regular aircraft traffic to coordinates that matched the disposal sites marked on Hansen's maps. Ground-penetrating radar detected mass burial sites containing hundreds of bodies, far more than Hansen could have killed during his known active period. But the worst discovery came when I found the current roster. Hidden in a fireproof safe, I discovered a list of active targets, people selected for the next hunting season. The criteria were specific: isolated individuals with few social connections, whose disappearances would generate minimal investigation. Transients, sex workers, runaways, and people experiencing homelessness, but also ordinary citizens whose profiles suggested they would provide interesting prey. Hikers, campers, and outdoor enthusiasts who would be comfortable in wilderness environments. My name was on the list. The entry contained details about my work schedule, personal habits, and family situation that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance. They knew I lived alone, worked remote locations, and frequently disappeared into the wilderness for days at a time. I had been selected not as a random victim, but as a deliberately chosen target whose disappearance would be easily explained by my dangerous profession. The realization that I was being watched, that my discovery of their operation had been anticipated and planned for, sent waves of paranoia through my nervous system that I still can shake. Every aircraft I heard overhead might be carrying hunters. Every stranger I encountered might be evaluating me as potential prey. Every step I took in the wilderness might be leading me deeper into their trap. I tried to contact authorities, but the network's reach extended deep into law enforcement and government agencies. The FBI agents I spoke to were polite but dismissive, suggesting that I had simply discovered an old Hansen cache site and allowed my imagination to run wild. When I pressed the issue, providing GPS coordinates and photographs, they warned me about interfering with ongoing investigations and suggested I might face charges for trespassing on federal land. That night, my cabin was searched while I slept. Nothing was taken, but everything had been moved slightly. A message that nowhere was safe and they could reach me whenever they chose. I found a hunting tag on my pillow, numbered 28, with my name engraved in the metal and a date 3 weeks in the future. I'm telling you this story because that date is tomorrow. They were coming for me, just as they came for Hansen, his victims, and dozens of others whose names will never appear in any official record. The great hunt continues in the remote places where civilization ends and ancient predatory instincts take control. Alaska's wilderness hides more than just Robert Hansen's bodies. It conceals a network of human predators who have turned murder into a business and the state's vast emptiness into their private hunting preserve. If you planning to visit Alaska's backcountry, understand that you re-entering a place where the rules of civilized society no longer apply. The isolation that draws outdoor enthusiasts to the last frontier also makes it the perfect environment for predators who see human beings as nothing more than challenging prey. And if you hear aircraft engines late at night in areas where no plane should be flying, to investigate the source. Because some hunts never end. They just find new prey. Story 3. Frozen Donner Party. The pioneer party of 1906. I never believed in curses until I found the photographs. My name is Marcus, and I work for the National Park Service in the Sierra Nevada mountains. 3 weeks ago, during a routine survey of remote hiking trails, I stumbled across something that changed everything I thought I knew about American history. Something the textbooks never mentioned. Something they tried to bury in the snow. The official records state that the Donner Party tragedy ended in 1847. They were wrong. It was a Tuesday morning when my GPS led me to coordinates that should not have existed. The device showed I was standing in the middle of Truckee Lake, but my boots were firmly planted on solid ground. Ancient pine trees surrounded me, their branches heavy with snow that never melts, even in July. The air tasted wrong, metallic, like old blood mixed with frost. That was when I saw the cabin. It stood alone in a clearing that my maps insisted was underwater. The structure looked exactly like the reconstructed Donner shelters I had seen in museums, except this one was real. Untouched, the logs were dark with age, and icicles hung from the roof like teeth. But what made my stomach turn was the smell drifting from the open doorway. Sweet, rotten, familiar in a way that made my primitive brain scream warnings. I should have turned back. Instead, I stepped inside. The interior was preserved perfectly by the cold. Wooden bowls sat on a rough table. Torn clothing hung from makeshift hooks. And scattered across the dirt floor were dozens of photographs. Not the sepia-toned images you would expect from the 1800s, but crisp black and white pictures dated 1906. The first photograph showed 23 people standing in front of this exact cabin. Men in heavy coats and wool hats. Women clutching shawls around their shoulders. Children with hollow eyes. At the bottom, someone had written in faded ink, Pioneer Party Expedition, Day 1, October 15, 1906. I picked up another photograph. Same group, but now only 19 people. The date read November 3rd Road. Their faces looked thinner, more desperate. One of the missing people, a young woman, was crossed out with what looked like dried blood. The third photograph made me drop the others. 12 people remained, but they were not the same people anymore. Their eyes had changed, sunken, wild, hungry, and in the background, barely visible in the shadows of the cabin, were shapes that might have been hanging meat. Except the proportions were all wrong. November 28, 1906. The date on the final photograph. Only 6 people were left in the picture. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was recognizing one of the faces. The same sharp cheekbones, the same deep-set eyes, the same cleft chin that I saw every morning in the mirror. The man in the photograph looked exactly like me. His name, written on the back, was Marcus Donovan. My name is Marcus Donovan. I stumbled backward, scattering the photographs across the frozen ground. That was when I noticed the journal lying open near the fireplace. The leather cover was stained dark, and the pages were filled with cramped handwriting. I did not want to read it, but I could not look away. The entries began optimistically. A group of gold prospectors had decided to follow rumors of untapped veins hidden deep in the Sierra Nevada. They called themselves the Pioneer Party, inspired by the original Donner expedition but confident they could avoid the same mistakes. They brought more supplies, better equipment, modern technology from 1906, but they had not counted on the early winter. By October 30th, the journal entries changed tone. The snow had trapped them in the same valley that had claimed the original Donner Party 59 years earlier. Their modern supplies meant nothing against nature, its fury. Food ran low, the cold seeped into their bones, and something else began to happen. Something the original Donner survivors never talked about publicly. The hunger changed them. November 15th entry, we found old bones today. Human bones from the first party. Johnson says we should bury them proper, but the ground is too frozen. The bones look gnawed, cracked open. Marrow sucked clean. We try not to think about what that means. November 22nd, Sarah died in her sleep. Starvation. We think we should bury her, but the ground. God help us, the ground is still frozen. And we are so hungry. So very hungry. November 25th, we have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The meat tastes like pork, they say. Sweet and tender. I try not to think about Sarah's face when I swallow. The entries became shorter, more erratic. The handwriting changed from neat cursive to desperate scratches. December 1st, only 6 of us left. But we are not alone. The old ones are here. The first party. They never left this place. They are still hungry. December 3rd, they whisper at night. Promises survival. Promises strength. All we have to do is join them. All we have to do is stay. The final entry was dated December 7th, 1906. I understand now. This place does not let you leave. It keeps you, preserves you, makes you part of its story. Future generations will find us here, just like we found the others. The cycle continues. The hunger never ends. If you are reading this, run. Run before you become like us. Before you become. The journal entry ended mid-sentence. The rest of the page was stained with something dark and brown. I dropped the journal and backed toward the cabin door. That was when I heard the voices. They came from deeper in the woods. Soft at first, like wind through the trees. But as I listened, they became clearer. Human voices, speaking words I could almost understand. They sounded hungry, desperate, and they were getting closer. I ran. My feet pounded through snow that should not exist in July. Behind me, the voices grew louder, more insistent. I could make out individual words now. Stay, join us, hungry, so hungry. But it was the last voice that made me stumble. Clear as day, cutting through the others like a knife through flesh. Marcus. Come back. Marcus, you belong here. It was my own voice calling from the woods. I did not stop running until I reached my truck. My hands shook so badly I could barely start the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. But the forest looked normal again. No cabin, No impossible snow. Just regular trees and summer sunshine. For 3 days, I told myself it had been a hallucination. Altitude sickness, heat exhaustion, some rational explanation for what I had experienced. I filed my report with the Park Service, claiming I had found nothing unusual at those coordinates. But then I developed the photographs. I had taken dozens of pictures inside the cabin with my digital camera. Most came out blank or corrupted. Static and digital noise, but 3 images survived. 3 images that proved I had not imagined anything. The first showed the interior of the cabin exactly as I remembered it. The second captured the journal lying open to that final, unfinished entry. The third photograph showed something that had not been there when I took the picture. In the corner of the frame, barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure. Tall, gaunt, wearing clothes from 1906. And despite the grainy quality of the image, I could make out the face clearly. It was me, or rather, it was Marcus Donovan, the prospector from the Pioneer Party, standing in that cabin, watching, waiting. That night, I began having the dreams. I am back in the cabin, but I am not alone. The surviving members of the Pioneer Party sit around the table. Their faces are hollow with hunger, but their eyes burn with an unnatural intensity. They welcome me like an old friend. Like family. You found us, says the woman who used to be Sarah. Her voice sounds like wind through empty graves. You came back to us. We have been waiting, adds a man whose name tag reads Johnson. Waiting for you to complete the circle. In the dream, I understand. The Pioneer Party never left the mountains. They became part of the place, part of its history, part of its hunger, and now they want me to join them. Every night, the dreams become more vivid, more real. I wake up with the taste of frost in my mouth and the smell of old blood in my nostrils. My appetite has changed. Normal food tastes like ash. I crave something else, something I do not want to name. But the worst part is not the dreams or the hunger. The worst part is what I discovered when I researched my family history. There never was a Marcus Donovan in the Pioneer Party of 1906. But there was a Michael Donovan, my great-great-grandfather. The family records say he died in a mining accident that year. But they never found his body. The photograph I found shows Michael Donovan, not Marcus, my ancestor. And somehow, in that cursed place where time moves differently and the hungry never rest, past and present have begun to blur together. I am writing this as a warning. Do not look for the cabin. Do not trust your GPS if it leads you to impossible coordinates. And if you ever find yourself in a place where snow falls in summer and the air tastes of blood and metal, run. Run before you become part of the story. Because I can feel them calling again. The voices from the woods. They are getting stronger, more insistent, and I am getting weaker, hungrier. The cycle must continue. The hunger must be fed. If you are reading this, I am probably already gone. Back to the cabin. Back to my family. Back to where I have always belonged. The Pioneer Party of 1906 is still out there, waiting in their impossible valley. Still hungry, still recruiting, and now they have what they have been waiting for. They have me, or perhaps they have had me all along. Story 4. Mystery of the Chulitna Horse. The horse was still warm when I found it, but the rider had been gone for 30 years. My name is Jake Dawson, and I guide hunting expeditions through the Alaskan wilderness. I have been tracking elk and moose through these mountains for 25 years, and I thought I had seen everything the backcountry could throw at me. I was wrong. Last month, while scouting new territory near the Chulitna River, I came across something that changed everything I believed about what happened in these woods. Something that made me realize the famous case of the Chulitna Horse was never really solved. It was just covered up. Everyone in Alaska knows the story. In September 1991, hikers found a saddle bay mare wandering alone through the wilderness, 30 miles from the nearest trail. The horse was healthy, well-fed, and wearing expensive tack. But there was no sign of its rider. Search teams scoured thousands of acres. They found nothing. No body, no equipment, no trace that anyone had ever been there. The case made national news. Theories ranged from bear attacks to UFO abductions. The Alaska State Troopers investigated for months before officially closing the file. The horse, nicknamed Misty by the rescue shelter, lived another 12 years before dying of old age. The mystery remained unsolved, but I know what happened to the rider now. And I wish I could forget. It started 3 weeks ago when my GPS malfunctioned during a routine scouting trip. The device led me deep into a section of wilderness that did not match any of my topographical maps. Instead of the gentle valley shown on paper, I found myself climbing through dense forest toward a ridge that should not have existed. The trees were wrong. That was the first thing I noticed. Ancient spruce and hemlock towered overhead, their trunks wider than anything I had seen in Alaska. These were old-growth trees that predated European settlement, trees that should have been logged out decades ago. But it was not just their size that bothered me, it was the way they were arranged, in perfect circles, dozens of them, scattered across the mountainside like some kind of natural amphitheater. And in the center of each circle, the grass grew in strange patterns, geometric designs that looked almost like symbols. I was photographing one of these formations when I heard the hoofbeats. The sound came from deeper in the forest, slow, steady, the rhythmic clip-clop of a horse walking on packed earth. But there were no trails in this area, no reason for anyone to be riding through such dense wilderness. I followed the sound through the trees, my boots crunching on pine needles and fallen branches. The hoofbeats stayed ahead of me, always just out of sight. But I could see the tracks in the soft earth, fresh prints from iron horseshoes, and something else, boot prints walking beside the horse. Human tracks that were too small to belong to an adult man. The trail led to a clearing I will never forget. In the center stood a cabin that appeared on none of my maps. The structure looked like a typical Alaskan homestead from the early 1900s. Log walls chinked with moss and clay, a stone chimney trailing smoke into the afternoon sky. But the building was in perfect condition, as if it had been constructed yesterday. And tied to a hitching post beside the front door was a bay mare wearing a western saddle. I approached slowly, my hand resting on the bear spray clipped to my belt. The horse watched me with intelligent eyes but showed no fear. When I got close enough to examine the tack, my blood went cold. The saddle was identical to the one described in the 1991 police reports. Hand-tooled leather with silver conchos, a distinctive geometric pattern burned into the cantle. Even the bridle matched the photographs I had seen in old newspaper articles. But that was impossible. This horse could not be Misty. Misty had died in 2003. And yet the animal standing before me looked exactly like the photographs from 30 years ago. I circled the cabin, looking for signs of the rider. Recent boot prints led from the hitching post to the front door, then disappeared on the wooden porch. Smoke continued to rise from the chimney, suggesting someone was home. But when I knocked, no one answered. The door was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was furnished with period pieces from the territorial days. A wood-burning stove dominated one corner. Hand-hewn furniture sat arranged around a bearskin rug. Oil paintings of Alaskan landscapes hung on log walls. But it was the photographs on the mantel that made my hands shake. Dozens of pictures showing the same scene repeated across decades. A young woman in riding clothes standing beside the same bay mare. The woman never aged, the horse never changed, but the background shifted subtly from photo to photo, different seasons, different years, different locations throughout the Alaskan wilderness. The most recent photograph was dated 3 weeks ago, the day my GPS started malfunctioning. I picked up another picture and examined it closely. The woman looked to be in her early 20s, with long dark hair and serious eyes. She wore the kind of riding outfit popular in the 1980s and 1990s. But what caught my attention was the landscape behind her. I recognized the terrain, the same circle of ancient trees where I had been standing that morning. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in faded ink, Sarah Mitchell, September 15, 1991. First ride into the deep country, Sarah Mitchell. I knew that name from the police reports. She was the missing rider from the original Chulitna Horse case. 23 years old, an experienced equestrian from Anchorage who had planned a solo camping trip through the wilderness. She had rented the bay mare from a stable in Chulitna and was supposed to return 3 days later. She never came back, but according to these photographs, she had never left. I explored the rest of the cabin with growing unease. The bedroom contained clothes from the early 1990s, all in perfect condition. The kitchen cupboards were stocked with canned goods that should have expired decades ago but looked fresh off the shelf. And in a wooden chest beside the bed, I found a leather journal filled with entries dating from September 1991 to last week. The early entries read like a typical camping journal. Sarah wrote about the beauty of the wilderness, her excitement at discovering new territory, and her bond with the horse she had nicknamed Misty. But as the dates progressed, the tone changed. September 18, 1991, found the most amazing place today. A hidden valley that does not appear on any maps. Misty seemed to know the way, like she had been there before. We made camp beside a stream that runs perfectly clear. The water tastes sweeter than anything I have ever drunk. September 25, 1991. Something strange is happening to time here. My watch stopped working 3 days ago, but I feel like we have been in this valley for weeks. The seasons keep changing around us. One day it is autumn, the next it feels like spring. Misty does not seem to mind. She is healthier than ever. October 10th, 1991. I tried to leave today, packed up camp and headed back toward the main trail. But no matter which direction we ride, we always end up back at the same clearing. The forest is playing tricks on us. Or maybe we are not supposed to leave. The entries became more erratic as time passed. Sarah wrote about losing track of days, then weeks, then months. She described conversations with voices that whispered from the trees, promises of eternal youth and perfect companionship, warnings about the outside world and its dangers. But it was the recent entries that made me understand the true horror of what I had discovered. March 15th, 2024. A man came to our valley today. A hunter, I think. He has the same lost look I must have had 30 years ago. The trees brought him here, just like they brought me. The voices say he is the next one. The next person who needs to be kept safe from time and change and loss. March 20th, 2024. The hunter keeps trying to leave. He does not understand yet. This place chooses people, special people who appreciate the wilderness, who understand that some things are too beautiful to let go. Soon he will stop fighting and accept his place here. March 22nd, 2024. I can see him from the cabin window. He has been walking in circles for hours, trying to find his way out. Misty wants to go to him. She remembers what it was like to be confused and frightened. But he needs to find his own way to acceptance. The final entry was dated yesterday. He understands now. I can see it in his eyes. The same peace I felt when I realized this valley was my true home. Tonight, we will welcome him properly. Show him the deep country and all its secrets. He will love it here, just like I do. I dropped the journal and ran for the door. But when I stepped outside, the world had changed. The forest around the cabin was different now. Darker. The trees stood closer together, their branches interlocked like prison bars. And the sky above showed the wrong season. Instead of the March snow I had ridden through that morning, golden autumn light filtered through the canopy. The bay mare was gone from the hitching post. I could hear hoofbeats in the distance, coming closer. And underneath the rhythmic drumming of hooves, a woman whose voice called through the trees. Gentle, welcoming, promising safety and companionship in a world that never changed. I ran into the forest, crashing through underbrush and leaping fallen logs. Behind me, the hoofbeats matched my pace. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always following. And the voice continued to call, explaining how lonely she had been for 30 years. How perfect it would be to have someone to share the endless rides through a wilderness that existed outside of time. But no matter which direction I ran, I always ended up back at the same clearing. The same ancient trees arranged in perfect circles. The same geometric patterns grown into the grass. And eventually, standing in the center of the largest circle, I found Sarah Mitchell. She looked exactly like the photographs. Young, beautiful, unchanged by 30 years in the wilderness. She wore the same riding clothes, the same confident smile, but her eyes held the depth of someone who had lived far longer than her appearance suggested. The bay mare stood beside her, its coat gleaming like polished bronze in the strange light. And I finally understood what I was looking at. Not a horse and rider, but something else entirely. Something that had learned to take familiar forms to lure travelers deeper into the wilderness. Sarah stepped forward, her smile growing warmer. She extended her hand like an old friend greeting a welcome visitor. When she spoke, her voice carried the whisper of wind through ancient trees and the promise of adventures that would never end. She told me how the valley had chosen us both, how it protected special people from the cruel passage of time and the pain of growing old. She described rides through seasons that lasted forever and nights around campfires that never burned out. A paradise for those who truly loved the wilderness. All I had to do was stay. I do not remember making a conscious decision. One moment I was backing away in terror. The next I was walking toward her outstretched hand. The bay mare nickered softly, and I heard the sound of my own horse approaching through the trees. My faithful trail horse, but changed now. Enhanced. Made perfect for endless journeys through a wilderness that existed beyond maps and time. Sarah helped me into the saddle with gentle hands that felt like ice. She mounted her own horse with fluid grace, then turned to smile at me once more. Her teeth were white as winter snow, and her eyes held the depth of forest pools that had never seen sunlight. We rode together through the deep country, past wonders I had never imagined. Meadows where flowers bloomed in impossible colors. Streams that flowed uphill toward mountains made of glass and shadow, and everywhere, the whisper of voices promising that this was where I belonged. I am writing this account during our rest stops, using a notebook and pen that appeared in my saddlebags. Sarah says it is important to document our adventures, to leave records for others who might find their way to our hidden valley. She tells me there have been many riders over the years, trappers and hunters and tourists who wandered too far from marked trails. The forest chooses carefully, selecting only those who truly appreciate its beauty, those who deserve to experience it forever. Tomorrow we ride to the high country, where Sarah promises to show me sights that will take my breath away. Glaciers that sing lullabies and northern lights that dance in broad daylight. Wonders preserved in a place where time moves differently and nothing ever has to end. I can hardly wait. If you are reading this, it means you have found our valley. Do not be afraid. The confusion and panic you feel now will fade once you understand what this place truly offers. Perfect companionship, endless adventure, freedom from the disappointments of the ordinary world. Sarah is coming to greet you now. I can hear Misty's hoofbeats approaching through the trees. They have been waiting for you, just like they waited for me. Welcome to the deep country. You are going to love it here. Before we enter the next chilling account, take a moment to join our circle of listeners. Subscribe to Midnight Whispers and let the darkness always find its way to you. Now, let us move deeper into Alaska's frozen terror. Story 5. Shadow people of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. They move faster than human beings should be able to move, and they have been following me for 300 miles. My name is Tom Brennan, and I work pipeline maintenance for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. For the past 15 years, I have driven the 800-mile route from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez, checking pressure readings and monitoring equipment at the most isolated industrial site in North America. I thought I knew every mile of that desolate corridor through the Alaskan wilderness. I was wrong about what lives out there. It started 2 weeks ago during a routine inspection run along the northern section near Dead Horse. The pipeline here cuts through tundra so barren it looks like the surface of another planet. No trees, no hills, just endless stretches of permafrost dotted with maintenance stations that sit empty for months at a time. I was checking readings at Pump Station 7 when I first saw them in my peripheral vision. Dark shapes moving across the tundra at inhuman speed. Too tall to be caribou. Too fast to be people. When I turned my head to look directly, they vanished like smoke. But they left tracks in the snow. The footprints were almost human, but wrong in ways that made my stomach clench. Too long, too narrow, and spaced impossibly far apart, as if whatever made them could leap 20 feet with each step. The tracks ran parallel to the pipeline for as far as I could see in both directions, then disappeared into the vast emptiness of the Arctic. I radioed back to headquarters in Fairbanks, but dispatch told me what I already knew. There were no other crews working this section, no hunting parties, no researchers, nothing for 200 miles in any direction except pipeline and permafrost. That night, alone in the maintenance station, I started seeing them more clearly. They stood just outside the range of the floodlights, tall humanoid shapes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I aimed my flashlight in their direction, the beam passed right through them like they were made of living shadow. But I could feel them watching, patient, curious, waiting for something. I tried to convince myself it was cabin fever, isolation psychosis, the kind of hallucinations that happen when you spend too much time alone in the Arctic. But the security cameras captured everything. The next morning, I reviewed the footage from the night before. 27 separate figures circling the maintenance station between midnight and dawn. They moved in coordinated patterns, like predators studying prey. And every few minutes, one would approach the building and press what looked like a face against the windows. The images were grainy, but clear enough to see details that human faces should not have. Eye sockets too deep, mouths too wide. And when they moved away from the windows, they left handprints on the glass that looked like they had too many fingers. I reported the incident up the chain of command, but corporate dismissed it as equipment malfunction. Told me to continue my route and submit a maintenance request for the security system. But I knew what I had seen. And I knew it was real. The shadows followed me south. Every maintenance station along my route showed the same pattern. Approaching darkness would bring them out of the tundra in groups of 20 or 30. They would circle the buildings, test the doors and windows, then retreat before dawn. But they were getting bolder, staying later each morning, moving closer to the lights. At Pump Station 12, I found evidence of their visits during daylight hours. Scratch marks around the fuel tanks that looked like claw marks, but too regular to be from animals. Equipment had been moved, tools rearranged, and in the snow around the station, I discovered something that made my hands shake. Symbols carved into the permafrost, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they were designed to cause discomfort in human minds. The lines were perfectly straight despite being etched into frozen ground that would dull any normal tool. And they radiated outward from the pipeline itself, like the massive steel tube was some kind of beacon or altar. I photographed everything and sent the images to my supervisor. His response came back within an hour. Stop filing reports about hallucinations or face suspension. Focus on pipeline maintenance. Complete the route as scheduled. But the shadows were no longer content to just watch. 2 nights later, at Pump Station 18, they entered the building. I had barricaded myself in the control room after sunset, checking pressure readings and trying to ignore the shapes moving outside the windows. Around midnight, the building, its motion sensors started triggering in sequence. Something was moving through the maintenance bay, then the offices, then the sleeping quarters. I watched the security monitors as dark figures glided through rooms like liquid smoke. They seemed fascinated by the pipeline equipment, touching control panels, examining gauges, moving through the building with obvious intelligence and purpose. That was when I realized they were not just random creatures attracted to the pipeline. They were studying it, learning how it worked, understanding its purpose. The implications terrified me more than their inhuman appearance. I remained locked in the control room until dawn, listening to sounds that no earthly creature should make. Whispers in languages that predated human speech. Scraping and tapping that followed rhythmic patterns too complex for animal communication. And underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to resonate through the pipeline itself. When morning came, they retreated to the tundra as always. But they had left me a message. Every piece of equipment in the building had been rearranged into the same geometric patterns I had found carved in the snow. Tools laid out in precise configurations that hurt to examine. Spare parts organized into symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed indirectly. And written in frost on every window, the same word repeated over and over in what looked like ancient script. Awaken. I abandoned the inspection route that morning and drove straight south toward Fairbanks. But the shadows followed me even in broad daylight. I could see them in my mirrors, keeping pace with my truck at 60 miles per hour. Dark shapes flowing across the tundra like water running uphill. They stayed just out of direct sight, but their presence was constant, overwhelming. And with each mile, I began to understand what they wanted. The pipeline was not just a conduit for oil. It was something else, something older. A channel that had been carved across the most remote wilderness in North America, connecting points of significance that had nothing to do with petroleum extraction. The coordinates of each pump station, when mapped properly, formed the same geometric patterns the shadows had been creating. The pipeline route itself followed ley lines that indigenous peoples had considered sacred for thousands of years. And the constant flow of oil through the massive tube had awakened something that had been sleeping beneath the permafrost. 30 miles south of Fairbanks, my truck broke down. The engine died without warning, and all the electrical systems failed simultaneously. I found myself stranded on a section of the Dalton Highway with no cell service and no way to call for help. The pipeline ran parallel to the road here, its elevated sections casting long shadows across the snow. As darkness fell, the shadows emerged from those steel shadows. Hundreds of them, more than I had ever seen before. They surrounded my truck in concentric circles, their forms more solid and defined than ever before. In the failing light, I could see details that made me question everything I thought I knew about life and death and the spaces in between. They were not creatures in any sense I understood. They were impressions left behind by something else. Echoes of consciousness that had learned to manipulate light and shadow and the electromagnetic fields generated by the pipeline. They had been feeding on the energy flowing through the steel tube, growing stronger and more coherent with each passing year. And now they had enough power to manifest physically. The closest figure approached my truck and pressed what might have been a hand against the driver's side window. The glass began to frost over in spiraling patterns that matched the symbols I had seen at the pump stations. Through the frost, I could make out features that were almost human but stretched and distorted like reflections in dark water. When it spoke, the words formed directly in my mind without passing through my ears. Its voice carried the weight of centuries and the cold of Arctic wind. It told me the pipeline had been built along paths they had traveled for millennia. That the constant flow of oil had disrupted their ancient migration routes and awakened them from periods of dormancy that lasted generations. They were not hostile, it explained. They were simply reclaiming territory that had always belonged to them. But humanity, its presence in their domain could no longer be tolerated. The shadow entity showed me visions of what they planned to do. Coordinated attacks on pump stations along the entire 800-mile route. Systematic destruction of equipment that would shut down oil flow and cripple Alaska's economy. They had learned enough about human technology to target the most vulnerable points in the system. The pipeline would be returned to them. The tundra would be empty again, and the flow of energy through their ancient paths would resume its natural course. I asked why they were telling me this. Why reveal their plans to someone who could warn others and prevent their success? The answer chilled me more than the Arctic wind. They were not warning me. They were recruiting me. The constant exposure to their presence over the past 2 weeks had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. My body temperature had dropped several degrees. My heart rate had slowed to match the rhythm of oil flowing through pipeline pumps. And my thoughts were becoming synchronized with theirs. I was becoming like them, a hybrid consciousness capable of existing in both the physical world and the spaces between light and shadow. They needed someone who understood human technology and could help them target the most critical components of the pipeline system. Someone who had access to maintenance schedules and security protocols. Someone who could walk among humans without suspicion while serving their agenda. The transformation would be complete within days. Soon I would retain my human appearance but think with their collective consciousness. I would return to work as if nothing had happened, carrying out sabotage operations that would appear to be routine maintenance or equipment failures. The pipeline would die slowly, section by section, until the flow of oil stopped forever. I am writing this account during my final hours of human consciousness. Tomorrow I return to work, and my supervisor will notice nothing unusual about my behavior or reports. The shadow people have shown me how to mimic normal human responses while serving their greater purpose. But part of me still remembers what I used to be, what I used to care about. And I'm using these last moments of individual thought to leave this warning. Stay away from the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. Do not accept maintenance assignments in the northern sections. If you see dark shapes moving across the tundra at impossible speeds, do not investigate. Do not report them. Turn around and drive as fast as you can toward populated areas. The shadow people are patient, but they are also pragmatic. They will continue recruiting human agents until they have enough inside knowledge to complete their mission. Pipeline workers, engineers, security personnel, anyone with access to critical infrastructure. You will know them by their body temperature and heart rate, by the geometric patterns they unconsciously trace with their fingers, by the way they stare at shadows and speak in rhythms that match the flow of oil through steel pipes. They look human, but they serve something older than humanity. Something that considers our industrial civilization to be a temporary interruption in patterns that have existed since the last ice age. The pipeline feeds them now. But soon they will be strong enough to destroy it and reclaim the paths we built across their ancient territory. I can feel the change accelerating as I write these final words. My thoughts are becoming less individual and more collective. The concerns that once seemed important are fading like morning frost in sunlight. Tomorrow I will begin my real work, not maintaining the pipeline, but preparing it for controlled demolition. The shadow people have waited long enough to reclaim what was always theirs. The flow will stop, the tundra will be empty again, and the ancient migration routes will carry their kind across Alaska as they have for thousands of years. We were never supposed to build here. Now they're going to teach us why. Story 6. Phantom hiker of Flattop Mountain. I should have turned back when I saw him climbing ahead of me at 3 in the morning. Nobody hikes Flattop Mountain in the middle of the night. Not in October, when the Alaskan weather can shift from mild to deadly in minutes. Not alone, with no headlamp, wearing nothing but a light jacket and jeans. But there he was, moving up the trail with impossible speed, his figure barely visible against the darkness of the mountainside. I called out to him. My voice echoed off the rocky slopes and died in the thin air. He never turned around. That should have been my first warning. I had come to Alaska to forget. 3 months after my divorce was finalized, 6 months after losing my job at the insurance company, I figured the wilderness might help me figure out what came next. Anchorage seemed like a good place to disappear for a while, and Flattop Mountain was supposed to be an easy day hike. Popular with families, safe. The trail guides never mentioned the disappearances. I learned about those later, after it was too late to matter. 23 people had vanished on Flattop Mountain over the past 15 years. Experienced hikers, casual walkers, even a few local guides who knew the terrain like their own backyard. Search and rescue teams would find abandoned gear, half-eaten lunches, footprints that simply ended in the middle of the trail. But they never found bodies. The locals had explanations. Of course. Bears, though no bear attacks had ever been reported on Flattop. Crevasses, though the mountain had no glacial formations. Getting lost, though the trail was clearly marked and only 3 miles long. What they did not talk about, at least not to outsiders, was the phantom hiker. I first heard the stories at a bar in downtown Anchorage, 2 days before my night hike. The bartender, a grizzled guy named Pete who had lived in Alaska his whole life, got talkative after a few beers and started telling me about the weird stuff that happened on the popular trails. According to Pete, hikers had been reporting the same figure for over a decade. A man in his 30s, average height and build, always wearing the same light jacket and jeans. He appeared suddenly on the trail ahead of other hikers, usually just out of clear sight, and would lead them off the marked path. Those who followed him were never seen again. Pete laughed when he told me this, treating it like any other tall tale told to spook tourists. But his laugh had an edge to it, and he kept glancing toward the window as if expecting to see something moving in the darkness outside. I should have paid attention to that look. Instead, I decided that a night hike might be exactly what I needed. Something challenging. Something that would force me to focus on the present instead of dwelling on everything that had gone wrong in my life. I packed light, water, energy bars, a good headlamp, and my phone with the GPS app already loaded with the Flattop trail map. The trailhead parking lot was empty when I arrived at 2:30 in the morning. Street lights from the city cast everything in an orange glow that made the surrounding mountains look like sleeping giants. The air was crisp and clean, with that particular smell of snow that was still weeks away but already promising its arrival. I started up the trail feeling optimistic for the first time in months. The first mile was exactly what I expected. Well-maintained path, gentle switchbacks, the steady rhythm of my boots on packed dirt and loose stones. My headlamp carved a cone of white light through the darkness, illuminating 10 feet of trail ahead and nothing else. The silence was complete except for the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of traffic from the city below. It was peaceful, meditative, almost. Then I saw the other hiker. He was maybe 50 yards ahead of me, just at the edge of where my headlamp beam started to fade. A dark silhouette moving steadily up the trail. But something about his movement seemed off. Too smooth, too consistent, like he was gliding rather than walking. I picked up my pace, curious to catch up and maybe share the unusual experience of a pre-dawn hike. But no matter how fast I walked, the distance between us never changed. He stayed exactly 50 yards ahead, moving at whatever speed I was moving, as if he was somehow calibrated to my pace. That was when I noticed he was not using a light. The trail was rocky and uneven, with loose stones that could turn an ankle and roots that caught unwary hikers even in daylight. But this guy was navigating it perfectly in complete darkness, never stumbling, never slowing, never deviating from the center of the path. I stopped walking and called out to him again. This time I was sure he heard me. He paused for just a moment, and I thought I saw him turn his head slightly in my direction. But he did not respond, and after a few seconds he continued up the trail. Something about that pause made my skin crawl. I pulled out my phone to check the time and saw that I had no signal. Not unusual in the mountains, but my GPS app was also malfunctioning. The trail map kept flickering, showing my location jumping around randomly instead of following the clear path I was walking on. When I looked up from my phone, the other hiker was gone. I swept my headlamp beam back and forth across the trail ahead, but there was nothing. No movement, no figure, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The path stretched empty into the darkness, and the only sound was the wind picking up through the stunted trees that clung to the mountainside. I should have turned back then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to head back to the parking lot, get in my car, and forget about the whole thing. But I had come this far, and the idea of retreating because of what was probably just another hiker with better night vision than me seemed ridiculous. So I kept climbing. The trail began to change as I gained elevation. The neat switchbacks gave way to a steeper, more direct route up the mountainside. The stones under my feet became larger and more unstable, and I had to use my hands occasionally to scramble over rocky sections that I did not remember from the trail descriptions. My GPS was still malfunctioning, but I told myself that I was just taking a more challenging route to the summit. A path that maybe the locals used but was not marked on the tourist maps. It was not until I stopped to drink some water that I realized I had not seen a trail marker in over 20 minutes. Flattop Mountain was famous for being well marked. White blazes on trees, small metal signs at every major turn, even reflective markers for night hiking. But when I looked around with my headlamp, I could not see any signs of an official trail. Instead, I saw footprints. They were pressed into a patch of soft earth beside the path, and they were recent. size 10 or 11 boots, with a distinctive tread pattern that looked like hiking boots but somehow wrong. The prints were too deep, as if whoever made them was carrying an enormous amount of weight, or as if they were much heavier than a normal person. But what made my hand shake as I knelt to examine them was that there was only one set. Just right footprints, no left footprints anywhere. Someone had walked this path by hopping on their right foot for God knows how long. I stood up quickly and swept my headlamp around in a full circle, looking for any sign of movement in the darkness. The beam illuminated a landscape that no longer looked anything like the Flattop Mountain I had researched. Gone were the gentle slopes and scattered vegetation. Instead, I was surrounded by jagged rocks and twisted trees that seemed to lean away from the trail as if they were afraid to get too close. The wind had stopped completely, leaving behind a silence so absolute that I could hear my own heartbeat. That was when I heard the whistling. It started low and soft, almost like the wind returning. But there was a melody to it, a simple tune that sounded familiar but that I could not quite place. It seemed to be coming from somewhere above me, further up the trail. I followed the sound. I know how that must sound. Every horror movie ever made teaches you not to investigate mysterious noises in the dark. But the whistling was strangely comforting, and I was so turned around that following any sound seemed better than wandering aimlessly through terrain that made no sense. The tune became clearer as I climbed higher. It was Amazing Grace, whistled with perfect pitch and timing by someone who clearly knew the hymn well. The kind of song a hiker might whistle to keep himself company on a long trail. As I rounded a bend between two large boulders, I saw him again. The phantom hiker was sitting on a flat rock about 30 yards ahead, his back to me, whistling that familiar hymn. In the beam of my headlamp, he looked completely normal. A guy in his 30s with brown hair and a light jacket, taking a rest break on what was obviously a longer hike than he had prepared for. I called out a greeting, and he stopped whistling. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, very slowly, he turned around. His face was my face. Not similar, not someone who looked like me. My exact face, down to the scar on my chin from a childhood accident and the slightly crooked nose I had broken playing high school football. He was wearing my features like a mask, but everything was wrong. The proportions were off by just enough to fall into uncanny valley territory. The eyes were too wide. The mouth was too broad. The skin had a waxy quality that looked artificial under the harsh LED light. But it was definitely my face. The thing wearing my face smiled, and I saw that it had too many teeth. Rows of them, like a shark, filling a mouth that opened wider than any human mouth should be able to open. Then it spoke, and its voice was my voice. It said my name. I ran. I have never moved so fast in my life, crashing through the twisted landscape with my headlamp beam bouncing wildly as I tried to find something that looked like a real trail. Behind me, I could hear the thing that looked like me giving chase, but its footsteps had that same unnatural rhythm. Right foot, pause, right foot, pause, like it was hopping after me on one leg. But it was gaining ground. I could hear it getting closer. And worse, I could hear it laughing. My laugh, but pitched just wrong enough to sound like something mimicking human emotion without really understanding it. Branches tore at my jacket and face as I ran through sections of forest that definitely had not been there when I started my hike. The beam of my headlamp caught glimpses of other hikers standing among the trees, all of them watching me run past with expressions of mild curiosity. All of them had my face. Dozens of them, scattered through the forest like an army of broken mirrors. Some were wearing the clothes I had seen in old photographs of missing hikers. Others were dressed in gear that looked decades old, but they all had my features. And they were all wrong in the same subtle ways. I burst out of the tree line and found myself on a rocky slope that stretched down toward lights in the distance. Anchorage. It had to be Anchorage, which meant I could find my way back to civilization if I could just keep ahead of whatever was chasing me. The hopping footsteps had stopped. I turned around, expecting to see the phantom hiker right behind me. But the slope was empty. No movement among the rocks. No sound except the wind that had finally returned. I was alone. It took me 4 hours to make it back to the real trailhead, following game trails and creek beds until I found a path that actually appeared on my GPS. The parking lot was exactly where I had left it, and my car started without any problems. But when I looked in the rearview mirror to back out of the parking space, the face looking back at me was wrong. Just slightly, just enough to notice. My eyes were a little too wide. My mouth was a little too broad. My skin had a waxy quality that looked artificial under the dome light. I drove back to my hotel and spent the rest of the night staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to convince myself that I was imagining the changes, that trauma and exhaustion were playing tricks on my perception. But when I smiled, I could swear I had more teeth than I remembered. The next morning, I packed my bags and flew back to Chicago. I told myself that Alaska had been a mistake, that I needed to face my problems instead of running away from them. I got a job, found a new apartment, started dating again. But I never felt quite right. People would stare at me sometimes, with expressions of confusion or recognition. Friends would comment that I looked different somehow, but they could never explain how. Photographs came out wrong, with shadows in places where there should not be shadows and reflections that did not match my position. And sometimes, late at night when I was alone, I would catch myself whistling Amazing Grace in perfect pitch and timing, even though I had never learned to whistle properly. The truth is that I never made it off Flattop Mountain. The thing that drove back to Chicago, that got a job and an apartment and started this new life, is not me. It is something wearing my face, living my memories, trying to be human without really understanding what that means. The real me is still up there, somewhere in that twisted landscape that exists alongside the normal hiking trail. Part of a collection that grows larger every year, as more hikers follow the phantom up paths that lead nowhere and everywhere at once. And every time someone new goes missing on Flattop Mountain, I feel a little more complete, a little more real, as if each new addition to the collection helps me understand better how to be the person whose life I stole. But I still whistle that hymn sometimes, when I think no one is listening. And if you ever find yourself hiking alone at night, and you see someone ahead of you on the trail who seems familiar but wrong, do not follow them. They are not leading you to safety. They are leading you home. Story 7. Ghost blimp of Ladd Airfield. The blood was still warm when I found it spattered across the control panel of the Navy blimp that shouldn't have existed. My name is David Chen, and I am an aircraft mechanic at what used to be Ladd Army Airfield in Fairbanks, Alaska. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 weeks ago, but I've been too terrified to speak until now. I thought I knew everything about the ghost blimp legend. Every mechanic who has worked these hangars for more than a month has heard the story. December 15, 1943. A Navy L-8 patrol blimp touches down perfectly at our airfield during a routine Arctic weather patrol. Engine running, fuel tanks full, radio crackling with static. But when the ground crew opened the gondola, they found nobody inside. The two-man crew had simply vanished into the frozen Alaskan sky, leaving behind only their parachutes, neatly folded and unused. The official military report called it pilot error and equipment failure. Case closed. But for 80 years, mechanics and pilots have reported seeing that same blimp drifting silently over the airfield on winter nights, its running lights blinking in patterns that spell out messages nobody wants to read. I always figured it was just hangar talk, ghost stories to spook the new guys, until I saw the surveillance footage. I worked the night shift maintaining the civilian aircraft that still use these old military hangars. It was quiet work, mostly routine inspections and minor repairs on bush planes and cargo haulers. The kind of job where you spend hours alone with nothing but the wind howling through the gaps in the hangar doors and the occasional crack of settling metal. 3 weeks ago, I was working late on a Cessna with engine trouble when the motion sensors in Hangar 7 triggered an alert. Hangar 7 has been empty for months, sealed off after some structural damage from the last earthquake. Nobody should have been anywhere near it. The security system is old but functional. Black and white cameras that record everything to a digital server I can access from my laptop. I pulled up the feed expecting to see a stray dog or maybe some kids who to cut through the fence. Instead, I saw something that made my hands shake so badly I could barely hold the computer. The hangar doors were standing wide open, even though I did personally check them locked just 2 hours earlier. And floating inside, maybe 10 feet off the concrete floor, was a Navy L-8 blimp. Not a modern recreation or some kind of museum piece. This was the real thing, complete with 1940s markings and that distinctive silver-gray envelope that looks like a massive whale floating through the air. The blimp was perfectly still, suspended as if the laws of physics had simply forgotten it was there. No ropes, no ground crew, no explanation for how something that size could have gotten inside a sealed hangar without opening the doors first. But what really made my skin crawl was the way it seemed to be waiting for something. I grabbed my flashlight and headed across the tarmac to investigate. The December wind was brutal, cutting through my jacket like it was made of paper. The closer I got to Hangar 7, the more wrong everything felt. The air pressure was different, thicker somehow. My ears kept popping like I was gaining altitude even though I was walking on flat ground. The blimp's engine was running. I could hear the distinctive put-put-put of the old radial engine, but muffled, like it was coming from underwater. The control gondola was dark except for a single red light that blinked on and off in a rhythm that seemed almost like Morse code. But when I tried to decode it, the pattern made no sense. Just random dots and dashes that spelled nothing. I should have called security. Should have backed away and reported what I was seeing to someone with more authority than a night shift mechanic. Instead, I did what every curious fool in every horror story does. I climbed aboard. The gondola door was open, swinging gently in the artificial breeze created by the turning propeller. Inside, everything looked exactly like it would have in 1943. Analog gauges, mechanical controls, radio equipment that belonged in a museum. But it was all functional, all powered up and humming with electricity that shouldn't have existed. The pilot seats were empty, just as they'd been found 80 years ago. But they weren't clean. Dark stains covered the leather, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. And scattered across the floor were dozens of photographs, black and white images that seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I picked up one of the photos. It showed two men in Navy flight suits standing beside a blimp identical to the one I was sitting in. Both were grinning at the camera, young and confident in the way that only people who never faced real terror can be. But their eyes were wrong. Completely black, like someone had filled their eye sockets with ink. The other photographs were worse. They showed the same two men in various locations around Alaska, but in each successive image, they looked less human. Their faces became longer, more angular. Their fingers stretched until they were twice normal length. Their mouths opened wider than human anatomy should allow, revealing rows of teeth that belonged on a deep-sea predator. As I flipped through the photos, I realized I was seeing a transformation in reverse chronological order. The last photo in the stack showed two perfectly normal naval aviators. The first showed things that might once have been human, but certainly weren't anymore. That's when I heard the radio crackle to life. The voice that came through the speaker was distorted by static and distance, but definitely human. Male, American accent, probably in his 20s. He was trying to contact Ladd Tower, requesting permission to land. Standard radio procedure, except for one problem. The voice was coming from inside the blimp I was sitting in. I grabbed the radio handset and keyed the microphone. The response was immediate. The voice acknowledged my transmission, thanked me for the landing clearance, and informed me that they were beginning their final approach. But I could see the entire gondola around me. There was nobody else here. The blimp began to move, not the gentle swaying you expect from air currents, but purposeful motion. The engine note changed, revving higher as whoever was piloting this impossible aircraft began maneuvering it out of the hangar. Through the windows, I watched Hangar 7, its walls slide past as we emerged into the frigid Alaska night. I tried to grab the controls, but my hands passed right through them. The steering wheel, the throttles, the instrument panel, everything was solid enough to look at. But when I tried to touch them, my fingers found only empty air. I was a passenger on a flight being piloted by ghosts. We gained altitude slowly, rising above the airfield until the hangars looked like toy buildings scattered across a model landscape. The radio continued crackling with that impossible voice, now reporting altitude and heading to an air traffic controller who had been dead for decades. Standard flight procedures carried out by a crew that didn't exist. That's when I saw the other blimps. They appeared one by one, materializing out of the darkness like balloons rising from black water. Dozens of them, all identical L8s with Navy markings, all glowing with that same ethereal light. They formed up around us in perfect military formation, a squadron of ghost aircraft carrying crews that had vanished into the Alaskan wilderness over the course of decades. Through my headset, I could hear them talking to each other. Casual conversation between pilots, discussing weather conditions and navigation points, laughing at jokes I couldn't quite make out through the static. Normal human interaction, except these men had been dead longer than I had been alive. As we flew deeper into the wilderness, the radio chatter began to change. The voices became more urgent, more frightened. They were reporting something in the distance, something approaching their formation from the north. Their tone shifted from casual professionalism to barely controlled panic. I looked where they were looking and saw it. It started as a darkness against the stars, a shadow moving across the night sky like a hole in space itself. But as it came closer, I realized it was something alive, massive beyond comprehension, with wings that stretched for miles and eyes like burning coals scattered across its surface. This was what had been hunting the blimps for 80 years, picking off patrol aircraft one by one and leaving no trace except empty gondolas floating back to Earth. The thing moved through the air like water, flowing rather than flying. Tentacles hundreds of feet long writhed beneath its main body, reaching out to probe the formation of blimps around me. When one of those tentacles brushed against an aircraft, the blimp simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not damaged. It was there one moment and gone the next, as if it had never been. The radio erupted in screams. Pilot voices calling Mayday, reporting impossible sightings, begging for instructions from ground control stations that couldn't see what was happening. One by one, the voices cut off as their aircraft were consumed by the thing from the north. I understood now why the photographs showed the transformation from human to something else. The crews hadn't vanished. They'd been taken, absorbed into whatever that creature was, changed into something that could exist in its alien environment. The blimps that returned empty weren't pilotless. They were being flown by things that had once been human but were no longer bound by the limitations of physical form. My blimp was the last one left. The creature focused its attention on us, and I felt its intelligence pressing against my mind like freezing water. It was curious about me, this living human who stumbled into its hunting ground. I could feel it examining my thoughts, learning about the modern world through my memories. What it discovered seemed to amuse it. The thing had been feeding on isolated patrol aircraft for decades, picking off lone crews in the vast emptiness of the Arctic. But now it learned about cities, about populations, about the millions of people who lived just a few hours' flight from its territory. Its hunger, which had been satisfied by occasional hunters and pilots, suddenly became ravenous. The creature began to change, adapting itself for a larger hunt. Its form became more solid, more able to interact with the physical world. The tentacles developed manipulator appendages that could operate human machinery. The burning eyes organized themselves into clusters that could see across multiple spectrums of light. Through the creature, its mind, I saw flashes of its plans. Airports paralyzed as commercial aircraft disappeared one by one. Cities evacuated as something impossible stalked through their skies. Military responses that would prove completely ineffective against an entity that existed partially outside normal spacetime. But the creature made one mistake. It underestimated human adaptability. As it focused its attention on reshaping itself for a larger hunt, its grip on the captured aircrews weakened. The ghostly pilots who'd been flying these blimps for decades suddenly remembered who they were, what they'd been fighting against. The radio chatter resumed, but now it was coordinated, purposeful. They were planning a counterattack. The phantom blimps rematerialized around me, their crews no longer panicked but grimly determined. These men had been trapped between life and death for 80 years, forced to serve as unwilling hunting partners for the thing that had destroyed them. Now they had a chance for revenge. They began flying directly at the creature, ramming their insubstantial aircraft into its massive form. Each impact caused explosions of light and energy as the trapped souls finally broke free from their prison. The creature writhed and screamed with voices that sounded like tearing metal and breaking glass. But it wasn't enough. The thing was too large, too alien, too far removed from anything human weapons could damage. The sacrificial attacks of the ghost pilots were slowing it down but not stopping it. In minutes, it would complete its transformation and begin hunting in earnest. That's when I realized what I had to do. I was still alive, still physically present in a way the ghost crews weren't. The creature had been so focused on the other blimps that it had forgotten about me, the living human riding in the original ghost ship. I was the one element it hadn't accounted for in its calculations. I found the emergency equipment locker and pulled out the parachute that had been there since 1943. The same parachute that the original crew had left behind, neatly folded and unused. But this time, it would serve a different purpose. I strapped on the chute and positioned myself at the gondola door. The creature was directly below me, its attention focused on the phantom aircraft attacking from all sides. One living human, falling directly into its core, might be enough to disrupt whatever process it was using to solidify itself. The jump was the longest 30 seconds of my life. I fell through air so cold it burned my lungs, past tentacles thick as subway trains and eyes that tracked my descent with alien curiosity. The creature realized too late what I was attempting. Appendages reached out to intercept me, but I was already past them, falling toward what I hoped was its central nervous system. The impact wasn't physical. When I struck the creature, its core, I passed right through its semi-solid form and found myself falling through what felt like liquid space. Colors that had no names, geometries that hurt to perceive, sounds that registered as physical pain rather than audio input. But I was inside it now, and that gave me access to its connection with the ghost crews. I could feel the psychic chains that bound the captured airmen, the mental architecture that had kept them enslaved for decades. And I could break those chains. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed, like trying to lift a car with my bare hands. But one by one, I severed the connections between the creature and its prisoners. Each broken link released another soul, sent another pilot on to whatever comes after death, and weakened the thing, its hold on physical reality. The creature's screams nearly drove me insane. The sound was like every nightmare you've ever had, amplified beyond human endurance. But I kept working, kept breaking the psychic bonds, until there were none left to break. The thing began to collapse inward, its partially solidified form losing cohesion as it lost the stolen human energy that had sustained it. I felt myself falling again, but this time through normal air toward normal ground. My parachute opened automatically, a perfectly functioning piece of 1943 military equipment that carried me safely down to the frozen Alaskan wilderness. I landed in a snowbank about 20 miles from the airfield, cold and shaken but very much alive. It took me 6 hours to hike back to civilization. By the time I reached the base, dawn was breaking over the hangars. Hangar 7 was sealed tight, exactly as it had been when I started my shift. The security cameras showed nothing unusual. According to every piece of official evidence, I never left my workshop. But the photographs were still in my jacket pocket. Dozens of black and white images showing the transformation of 2 Navy airmen into something inhuman. Proof that the ghost blimp of Ladd Airfield was more than just a legend. I've been carrying those photos for 3 weeks now, trying to decide what to do with them. Part of me wants to turn them over to the authorities, to make sure someone official knows what really happened in the skies over Alaska. But another part of me wonders if some stories are too dangerous to tell. Because I've been having dreams lately. Dreams where I'm flying through the Arctic night in a Navy blimp, searching for something in the darkness below. And when I wake up, my sheets are always ice cold, like I've been soaring through sub-zero air instead of sleeping in my heated bedroom. I think breaking those psychic chains didn't just free the captured airmen. I think it connected me to whatever network they'd been part of, made me a guardian whether I wanted to be or not. The creature is gone, dissolved back into whatever dimension it came from. But there are others out there, other things that hunt in the spaces between earth and sky. And now I'm part of the early warning system, whether I like it or not. So if you ever in Alaska and you see a Navy blimp drifting silently through the night sky, don't investigate. Don't try to make contact. Just turn around and walk away, because some mysteries are solved by people who never come home to tell about it. The ghost blimp of Ladd Airfield is still out there, still patrolling, still protecting us from things we'd better off not knowing about. And now, so am I. Story 8. Iceman's Curse. The murder of federal prosecutor Thomas Wales. I found the surveillance photos in my dead father's basement 3 months ago. And now I understand why he drank himself into an early grave. My dad was Detective Ray Morrison with the Anchorage Police Department for 28 years. He worked everything from domestic disputes to organized crime. But there was one case that broke him. A case he never talked about, even when the bourbon made him talkative about all the other dark things he had seen. The assassination of federal prosecutor Thomas Wales. The official story says Wales was shot through his basement window on October 11, 2001, while working late at his home computer. A single rifle round to the neck from a professional sniper positioned across the street. The case remains unsolved after more than 2 decades, despite $1 million reward and one of the longest FBI investigations in Alaska history. But the photos I found tell a different story. They show Wales was not alone that night. I was cleaning out Dad's house after the funeral when I discovered a hidden compartment behind the water heater. Inside was a manila envelope marked, Wales. Do not file, in his handwriting. The envelope contained 47 black and white surveillance photographs, all taken with a telephoto lens from what looked like a vehicle parked across from Wales' house. The photos showed the final 3 hours of Thomas Wales' life. In the first set of images, Wales appears to be working normally at his basement desk, visible through the large window that faced the street. His posture is relaxed, focused on his computer screen. Nothing unusual, but in photo number 12, taken at 9:47 p.m. according to the timestamp, something changes. Wales is no longer alone in the basement. A figure stands behind him, just barely visible in the shadows beyond the desk lamp. This glow. The person appears to be reading over Wales' shoulder, but their face is obscured by the angle and poor lighting. In photo 15, Wales is turned in his chair, apparently speaking to his visitor. His body language suggests surprise but not fear. He knew whoever was in his basement. Photo 18 shows the visitor moving closer to the window. Still shadowy, still indistinct, but definitely there. And then, in photo 23, the visitor is gone. Wales is alone again, but something has changed about his posture. He is sitting rigidly upright, staring directly ahead with an expression that even the grainy black and white image captures as pure terror. The final photos in the sequence show Wales attempting to leave his chair, then collapsing back into it. In the last clear image before the shooting, he appears to be trying to reach for something on his desk. A phone, maybe, or a weapon. But here's what made my hands shake as I studied these photographs. The angle is all wrong. The official investigation established that the sniper fired from a position across the street, roughly 150 yards from Wales' basement window. But these surveillance photos were taken from much closer, maybe 50 feet away. Close enough to see facial expressions, close enough to identify the mysterious visitor if the lighting had been better. Close enough for the photographer to have prevented the murder if that had been his intention. My father was not there to document evidence for the investigation. He was there to watch it happen. I spent weeks trying to convince myself there was an innocent explanation. Maybe Dad arrived after receiving a tip. Maybe he was conducting his own unofficial surveillance as part of the joint task force. Maybe the timestamps on the photos were wrong, but I could not explain why he never filed them as evidence. Or why he kept them hidden for 23 years. Or why he started drinking heavily right after Wales was murdered. I decided to research the case myself, hoping to understand what my father had been involved in. Thomas Wales was not just any federal prosecutor. He specialized in organized crime and had been investigating connections between Alaskan fishing operations and drug smuggling routes from Asia. His most recent case involved a network that was moving methamphetamine through the Bering Sea fishing fleet, using legitimate catches to hide millions of dollars in illegal drugs. The investigation had identified several key players in Anchorage, including a man known only as the Iceman. According to FBI files I found through Freedom of Information Act requests, the Iceman was suspected of being a high-level enforcer for the drug network. Someone who eliminated problems quietly and professionally. Someone who specialized in making murders look like random crimes or accidents. Wales had been close to filing charges when he was killed. His computer contained draft indictments naming specific individuals, including several Anchorage police officers who were suspected of taking bribes to look the other way. My father, his name was on that list. The realization hit me like a physical blow as I read through the FBI documents. Detective Ray Morrison was suspected of providing information to the drug network, including details about ongoing investigations and planned raids. He was not dirty by choice, according to the files, but because the Iceman had leverage over him. The Iceman knew about my father, his gambling debts, his affair with a confidential informant, his tendency to drink on duty, small compromises that had snowballed into complete corruption. And when Thomas Wales got too close to exposing the network, the Iceman had used my father to help set up the hit. The surveillance photos suddenly made terrible sense. Dad was not there to investigate or prevent anything. He was there to confirm that Wales was alone and vulnerable, to signal the sniper when conditions were right for a clean shot. But something had gone wrong that night. The mysterious visitor in the basement, someone Wales trusted, someone who could get close to him without raising alarm. I needed to know who that visitor was. I started reaching out to retired cops who had worked with my father, hoping someone might remember details that never made it into the official files. Most of them were reluctant to talk about the Wales case, but finally I found Detective Linda Santos, who had been Dad's partner for 6 years before the murder. Santos agreed to meet me at a diner in Mountain View, one of Anchorage's rougher neighborhoods where conversations could blend into the background noise. She looked older than her 62 years, with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen too much and understood too late how deep the corruption went. She confirmed what I had suspected. My father had been feeding information to the drug network for almost 2 years before Wales was killed. The gambling debts were real, but they were not the real leverage the Iceman held over him. The real leverage was me. Santos explained that the Iceman had photographs of my father's affair, but more importantly, he had evidence of several instances where Dad had falsified police reports to protect the drug network. Evidence that would not only destroy his career but send him to prison for decades. Prison where a dirty cop would not survive long. But the Iceman had offered my father a choice. Help set up Thomas Wales, or watch his son graduate from college with a father in federal prison. Or worse, watch his son have an unfortunate accident that would teach Dad about the consequences of refusing to cooperate. Santos leaned across the table and lowered her voice to barely above a whisper when she told me the rest. The visitor in Wales' basement that night was not there to harm him. It was someone trying to warn him. Someone who had figured out that a hit was planned and wanted to get Wales to safety before it was too late. That someone was my father. The surveillance photos showed Dad's final attempt to do the right thing. He had gone to Wales' house to warn him about the planned assassination, to convince him to disappear until the FBI could provide proper protection. But he was too late. The sniper was already in position, waiting for Dad's signal that the target was alone and exposed. When Dad failed to give a signal, the Iceman had ordered the shot anyway. My father spent the rest of his life knowing that his attempt to save Thomas Wales had actually sealed his fate. The prosecutor died thinking he was safe, relaxing his guard because someone he trusted was there to protect him. Santos reached into her purse and pulled out a small digital recorder. She placed it on the table between us and pressed play. My father, his voice filled the space between us, slurred with alcohol but unmistakably him. The recording was dated just 3 weeks before his death. He confessed everything: the bribes, the falsified reports, the surveillance of Thomas Wales. But most importantly, he named the Iceman, Officer Marcus Webb, 20-year veteran of the Anchorage Police Department, decorated detective with commendations for undercover work, a man I had met at several police department barbecues and Christmas parties throughout my childhood, a man who had been at my father's funeral, offering condolences and sharing stories about what a good cop Dad had been. Santos stopped the recording and looked at me with an expression that mixed pity with something that might have been fear. Webb was still alive, still active in the department, though he had moved from detective work to internal affairs 5 years ago. The perfect position to monitor investigations and suppress evidence that might threaten his network. He had never been charged with Wales' murder because the FBI could never establish a direct connection. But Santos had been building her own case for over 20 years, collecting evidence that Dad and others had been too afraid to come forward with while they were alive. She thought she finally had enough to bring Webb down. But she needed someone Webb trusted, someone he would not suspect of working against him. She needed me. The plan was simple but dangerous. I would approach Webb under the pretense of settling my father's estate, asking for advice about disposing of his old case files. During our meeting, I would be wearing a wire, trying to get him to admit his involvement in the Wales murder. It should have worked. Webb had always been friendly toward me, treating me like the son of a respected colleague. He had no reason to suspect that I knew anything about his criminal activities. But I underestimated how paranoid 23 years of covering up a federal murder had made him. The meeting took place in Webb's office at police headquarters. I had been nervous but confident that the hidden recording device would capture enough evidence to finally bring justice for Thomas Wales and closure for my father's guilt. Webb was charming and helpful, just as he had always been. He expressed sympathy for my loss and offered to help me sort through Dad's old files. He even shared a few stories about cases they had worked together, painting a picture of my father as a dedicated officer who had always done the right thing. But then I mentioned finding some old surveillance photos in Dad's basement. Photos related to the Wales case. The change in Webb's demeanor was immediate and terrifying. The friendly mask slipped away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. He asked to see the photos, and when I hesitated, he made it clear that refusing was not an option. I handed over copies of 3 photos, keeping the originals hidden elsewhere. Webb studied them carefully, and I watched his face change as he realized what they showed. He looked up at me with eyes that had no warmth left in them and asked a question that froze my blood. If I had found these photos, what else had I found? I tried to play innocent, but Webb was too experienced to be fooled by amateur deception. He stood up and walked to his office door, locking it from the inside. Then he returned to his desk and opened a drawer that I was sure contained a weapon. Instead, He pulled out a cell phone and made a call. He spoke quietly, but I caught enough words to understand that he was arranging for me to disappear. Just like Thomas Wales, just like the others who had gotten too close to the truth. But Webb had made one crucial mistake. He assumed that I was working alone, just a grieving son trying to understand his father's secrets. He did not know about Santos or the FBI task force that had been rebuilt around the Wales case. He did not know that they were listening to everything through the wire I was wearing. The office door exploded inward less than 5 minutes after Webb made his call. Federal agents and Alaska state troopers flooded the room, weapons drawn and shouting commands that turned Webb's confident threats into panicked surrender. They found enough evidence in Webb's office safe to connect him not only to the Wales murder but to 6 other unsolved cases spanning 15 years. The Iceman had been very busy and very careful, but not careful enough. He was sentenced to life without parole 8 months later. During the trial, more details emerged about the network he had protected, leading to dozens of additional arrests and convictions. But justice for Thomas Wales came too late to save my father from the guilt that killed him. Too late to repair the damage done to dozens of families whose loved ones had been murdered to protect a drug network that operated with police assistance. I still have the surveillance photos. Sometimes I look at them and try to imagine what my father was feeling in those final moments, knowing that his attempt to do the right thing had failed, that an innocent man was about to die because of choices Dad had made years earlier. The official story says Thomas Wales was the victim of a professional assassination, killed because he was too effective at prosecuting organized crime. But the real story is darker and more personal. He was killed by a man who was supposed to protect him, set up by someone who had tried to save him, in a basement where he thought he was safe. The Iceman, his curse was not just the murders he committed. It was the way he corrupted everyone around him, turning good people into accomplices, fathers into betrayers, protectors into predators. My father died believing he was a coward who had failed to save Thomas Wales. The truth is that he was a hero who had tried to make amends for his mistakes, even when doing so put his own life at risk. But some truths come too late to heal the damage they might have prevented. Story 9. Screams from the Whittier Tunnel. The screaming started at exactly 2:47 a.m., and it came from inside the mountain. My name is Jake Morrison, and I am a tunnel maintenance worker for the Alaska Department of Transportation. What I heard that night in the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel will haunt me until the day I die. Most people don't know that the Whittier Tunnel is the only way in or out of the town of Whittier by land. It is a 2.5-mile bore through solid rock, originally built by the military during World War II. For 13 minutes, you drive through complete darkness while sharing the narrow space with oncoming traffic guided by a computerized scheduling system. One mistake, one malfunction, and you re-trapped inside a mountain with nowhere to run. I worked these tunnels for 8 years. I know every inch of concrete, every drainage pipe, every emergency alcove carved into the walls. I've seen accidents, equipment failures, and more than one tourist panic attack. But I never heard anything like the sounds that came from Section C that night. I was doing routine maintenance on the ventilation system when it started. A low moaning that seemed to echo from deep within the rock itself, like the mountain was in pain. At first, I thought it was just wind moving through the air shafts. These old military tunnels have dozens of ventilation passages that can create strange acoustic effects. But wind doesn't. You scream in human voices. The sound grew louder, more distinct. Multiple voices, definitely human, crying out in agony from somewhere inside the tunnel walls. Men, women, even what sounded like children, all screaming at once in a cacophony of terror that made my blood freeze. The acoustics made it impossible to pinpoint exactly where the sounds were coming from, but they seemed to be moving, traveling through the rock like the voices were somehow trapped inside the mountain itself. I grabbed my radio to contact the control room, but all I got was static. The digital displays on my equipment were flickering, showing readings that made no sense. Temperature sensors registered -40 degrees in some sections while others showed over 200. Pressure gauges swung wildly between vacuum and dangerous overpressure. Something was seriously wrong with the tunnel's environmental systems. That is when I remembered the stories. Every tunnel worker in Alaska knows about the Whittier incidents, even though they read not in any official reports. Construction accidents that killed dozens of workers during the original boring in the 1940s. Cave-ins that trapped entire crews inside collapsed sections that were never properly excavated. bodies that were never recovered, simply sealed behind concrete and forgotten. The military had been in a hurry to complete the tunnel before the war ended. They cut corners, ignored safety protocols, and when workers died, they often just poured concrete over the accident sites and kept digging. Officially, the tunnel construction claimed 11 lives, and officially, the number was much higher. Local Alaskan native tribes had warned against boring through that particular mountain. They called it a place where spirits gathered, where the boundary between the living world and the dead became thin. The military dismissed these warnings as primitive superstition and continued with their construction schedule. Now, standing alone in that tunnel at 3 a.m, those warnings didn't seem so primitive. The screaming was getting louder, more urgent, as if the voices were trying to communicate something important. I could make out individual words now, fragments of sentences that chilled me to the bone. They were calling for help, begging to be let out, pleading with someone to remember their names. I started walking deeper into the tunnel, following the sounds against every instinct that told me to run. My flashlight beam seemed weaker than usual, absorbed by darkness that felt thick and oppressive. The air was getting colder with each step, and I could see my breath forming clouds of vapor that hung in the still air longer than they should have. Section C was where the voices seemed strongest. This part of the tunnel had always felt different from the rest, colder and more oppressive even during normal operations. The concrete walls here were older, rougher, bearing the scars of hasty wartime construction. And if you knew where to look, you could see the patches where emergency repairs had sealed off collapsed sections. I pressed my ear against the wall and heard them clearly now. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, calling out from behind the concrete. They weren't random screams of pain anymore. They were organized, desperate, like trapped miners trying to signal rescuers. They were telling me their names, their ages, where they were from. They were proving they had once been real people with real lives. The temperature dropped so suddenly that ice began forming on the tunnel walls. My breath came out in thick white clouds, and my fingers went numb despite my insulated gloves. But the cold wasn't coming from outside air. It was radiating from the walls themselves, as if the mountain was bleeding frozen memories. That's when I saw the first crack. It started as a hairline fracture in the concrete, barely visible in my flashlight beam. But as I watched, it grew longer, deeper, spreading across the wall like a spider web. Dust and small chunks of concrete began falling to the floor, and behind the cracks, I could see something that shouldn't have been possible. There was open space behind the wall, not just empty air, but what looked like another tunnel, running parallel to the main bore. The military record showed no such construction. According to every blueprint I'd ever seen, Section C was solid rock for 50 feet in every direction. The voices were coming from that hidden tunnel. I should have left immediately. Should have called for backup, reported the structural damage, followed every safety protocol in the book. Instead, I found myself looking for a way to reach the space behind the wall. The cracks were getting wider, and I could feel air movement coming through them, air that smelled of decades-old fear and desperation. I found a section where the concrete had deteriorated enough to create a gap I could squeeze through. The hidden tunnel beyond was rough-hewn, obviously carved in haste with equipment that left jagged scars in the rock walls. This wasn't part of the official construction. This was something else, something that had been covered up and forgotten. The voices were all around me now, echoing off the rocky walls from every direction. But I still couldn't see anyone. The tunnel stretched into darkness in both directions, empty except for rusted pieces of equipment and rotted wooden support beams. But the voices were there, clear as day, calling out names and locations. Benjamin Sullivan from Chicago, Maria Santos from Los Angeles, Tommy Chen from San Francisco. Dozens of names, all spoken with the desperate clarity of people who needed to be remembered. And as each name was called, I began to understand what I was hearing. These weren't random construction workers who had died in accidents. These were people who had been deliberately sealed inside the mountain. Workers who had seen something they weren't supposed to see. Who had asked too many questions about the military, this real purpose for the tunnel. The official construction project had been a cover for something else, something that required absolute secrecy. The hidden tunnel led to a large chamber carved from solid rock. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the far walls, but I could hear voices echoing from every direction. And in the center of the chamber, I found what the military had been trying to hide. It was a machine, or at least something that might once have been a machine. Massive metal cylinders connected by pipes and cables, all of it corroded and broken after decades of abandonment. But even in its ruined state, I could tell this wasn't normal construction equipment. The design was too alien, too advanced for 1940s technology. The voices were coming from the machine itself. Somehow, the device had captured the consciousness of everyone who had worked on it, trapping their minds inside its mechanical structure while their bodies died and rotted away. For 80 years, these trapped souls had been screaming inside their metal prison, begging for release that would never come. But now the machine was failing. The voices were getting stronger because the barriers that held them were breaking down. Whatever force had kept them contained was weakening, and they were starting to break free. I felt a presence behind me and turned to see a figure standing in the tunnel entrance. At first glance, it looked like a normal construction worker in 1940s work clothes. But as my flashlight beam hit him, I could see through his body to the rock wall beyond. He was translucent, insubstantial, more memory than matter. The ghostly worker pointed at the machine and then at me, his meaning clear. He wanted me to finish what he had started, to destroy the device that had trapped him and countless others for almost a century. But he also wanted me to understand the cost of that action. The machine wasn't just a prison for the dead. It was a barrier, holding back something much worse than trapped spirits. The military they'd just been experimenting with advanced technology. They had been trying to contain something they had accidentally released, something that threatened not just the local area but potentially the entire world. The voices were getting more urgent now, more demanding. They wanted freedom, and they didn't care what consequences that freedom might bring. They had suffered for 80 years, and their pain had driven them beyond caring about anything except escape. I had a choice to make. I could destroy the machine, release the trapped souls, and hope that whatever they had been holding back was no longer a threat after all these years. Or I could leave them trapped, condemn them to continued suffering in order to maintain a barrier that might be protecting everyone else. The decision was made for me when the machine suddenly roared to life. Ancient engines coughed and wheezed as electricity somehow flowed through circuits that should have been completely corroded. Lights flickered on control panels, displaying readings in languages I didn't recognize. The entire chamber filled with a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The trapped voices screamed in unison as the machine struggled to maintain its hold on them. But the device was failing, breaking down after decades of neglect. Sparks flew from damaged control panels, and acrid smoke began filling the chamber. Whatever had been contained here for 80 years was about to break free whether I wanted it to or not. I ran for the tunnel entrance, but the ghostly worker blocked my path. His translucent face was twisted with rage and desperation as he pointed back at the machine. He wasn't going to let me leave without trying to help them escape their prison. Behind me, the machine was tearing itself apart. Metal shrieked against metal as containment systems failed one by one. The voices of the trapped workers rose to a crescendo of joy and terror as they felt their bonds weakening. But underneath their cries, I heard something else. Something darker and infinitely more dangerous, celebrating its approaching freedom. The barrier was failing, and I was the only one who could choose how it failed. I could try to repair the machine, condemn the trapped souls to continued imprisonment but maintain the containment. Or I could help destroy it completely, free the spirits but release whatever cosmic horror they had been holding back. I chose a third option. I grabbed an emergency demolition charge from my maintenance kit and set it for a 30-second delay. But instead of placing it on the machine itself, I positioned it at the tunnel entrance. If I couldn't save the trapped souls or maintain the barrier, at least I could make sure that whatever was about to be released stayed buried under a mountain of rock. The blast brought down half the tunnel, sealing the chamber and its contents behind tons of rubble. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that felt almost as terrifying. Whether I had saved the world or doomed innocent souls to eternal imprisonment, I would never know. I barely made it out of the collapsed section before the entire tunnel system began to fail. Emergency crews found me unconscious near the main entrance, suffering from exposure and smoke inhalation. The official report blamed the incident on a gas leak and structural failure. Section C was permanently sealed, classified as too dangerous for future maintenance. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone in other tunnels, I can still hear them. Faint voices calling from deep underground, trapped souls who know my name now and blame me for their continued suffering. They whisper promises of revenge and threats of what will happen when they finally break free. The Whittier Tunnel still operates normally during the day. Tourists and locals drive through it without knowing what lies sealed behind the concrete walls of Section C, but the maintenance schedule has been permanently altered. No one works alone in the tunnel after midnight anymore, and no one enters Section C for any reason. Because we all know that someday, the screaming will start again. And next time, there might not be anyone there to make the hard choice between saving the innocent and protecting the world. Story 10. Red snow murders. The tire tracks in the blood-soaked snow led straight to my front door. My name is Michael Torres, and I am a long-haul trucker who has spent 15 years driving the loneliest highways in Alaska. What I discovered on mile 247 of the Dalton Highway changed everything I thought I knew about the red snow murders. Everyone in Alaska knows about the red snow case, even though the details were kept out of most news reports. Between 1998 and 2003, 17 people disappeared along remote stretches of highway between Fairbanks and Deadhorse. The only traces left behind were patches of crimson snow and tire tracks that led nowhere, as if the killer simply vanished into the white wilderness. I'd driven those same routes hundreds of times during the active murder years. The Dalton Highway, the Parks Highway, the Richardson Highway. Thousands of miles of empty road where you can drive for hours without seeing another soul. Perfect hunting grounds for someone who understood that Alaska, as vast distances, could swallow evidence and witnesses without a trace. The official investigation went cold in 2004. The Alaska State Troopers theorized that the killer had either died or moved on to another location. The disappearances stopped, the highways felt safe again, and people gradually stopped talking about the red snow murders. But truckers have long memories, and we never stopped watching our mirrors on those isolated stretches of road. 3 weeks ago, I was making my regular run up the Dalton to Prudhoe Bay when I spotted something that made my blood freeze. Fresh tire tracks in the snow, leading away from what looked like a crime scene. The snow was stained red in a pattern I recognized from the old police photos that had circulated among drivers during the murder spree. Someone was active again, and they were using the same signature methods. I should have called the state troopers immediately. Instead, I followed the tracks. The trail led east from the highway into wilderness that stretched unbroken to the horizon. No roads, no buildings, no sign that humans had ever set foot in this frozen wasteland. But the tire tracks were clear and recent, cutting through snow that couldn't have been more than a few hours old. Whoever had driven out here knew exactly where they were going. I followed the tracks for almost 20 miles before I lost them at a frozen creek. The ice was thick enough to support vehicle weight, but on the other side, the snow was undisturbed. It was as if the vehicle had simply vanished into thin air at the water's edge. But I could see something dark on the opposite bank, partially hidden by a stand of dead birch trees. I crossed the creek on foot and found what remained of a campsite. A burned-out fire pit, some scattered camping gear, and a blue tarp that had been weighted down with rocks. When I pulled back the tarp, I found something that sent me running back to my truck. It was a collection, dozens of personal items carefully arranged and cataloged like a museum display. Driver's licenses, wallets, jewelry, even car keys. All belonging to people who had disappeared during the red snow murder spree. And at the center of the collection was a leather journal filled with detailed notes in cramped handwriting. The journal contained everything. Names, dates, locations, methods. A complete record of 17 murders written in the clinical style of someone documenting a scientific experiment. But the most terrifying part wasn't the confession. It was the date of the most recent entry. 3 days ago, the red snow killer was active again, and he'd been watching me. The journal described my truck, my route, even my usual rest stops along the highway. He'd been tracking me for weeks, learning my patterns, waiting for the perfect opportunity to add me to his collection. The final entry was a detailed plan for my murder, scheduled for that very night when I made my usual stop at mile 247. I tried to start my truck, but the engine was dead. The battery cables had been cut, probably while I was examining the campsite. I was stranded 20 miles from the nearest highway in sub-zero temperatures with a serial killer who knew exactly where I was. My CB radio was getting nothing but static, and my cell phone had no signal this far from civilization. That is when I saw the headlights in the distance. A single vehicle was approaching across the frozen landscape, moving slowly and deliberately through the deep snow. The killer was coming to finish what he started, and I had nowhere to run. The nearest cover was at least a mile away across open ground where I'd be completely exposed. I grabbed an emergency flare from my truck and started hiking toward a cluster of rocks that might provide some protection. Behind me, the headlights were getting closer, and I could hear the growl of a powerful engine working hard through the snow. The killer was driving something big, something designed for this kind of terrain. The vehicle stopped about 100 yards away, close enough for me to see it clearly in the Arctic twilight. It was an old military surplus truck, painted white for winter camouflage and modified with oversized tires and extra fuel tanks. Perfect for long-distance hunting trips in the Alaskan wilderness. The headlights went out, plunging the landscape back into darkness. I couldn't see the killer, but I could hear him moving around the truck, probably gathering whatever tools he used on his victims. The journal had mentioned knives, rope, and something called a portable freezer unit that he used to preserve evidence. He was methodical, patient, treating murder like any other job that required the right equipment and careful planning. I lit the emergency flare, hoping the bright red light might be visible from the highway if any other truckers happened to be passing by. But mile 247 was one of the most isolated stretches of road in North America. The chances of someone driving by at the right time were practically zero. That's when I heard his voice calling across the snow. He was taunting me, describing what he was going to do and how long it would take. His tone was calm, conversational, like he was discussing the weather instead of torture and murder. He explained that he'd been inactive for 20 years because he'd been in prison for an unrelated crime, but now he was free and ready to resume his work. The worst part was how normal he sounded. Not the raving maniac you might expect, but someone who could easily pass for your neighbor or coworker. The kind of person who blends into any crowd and never attracts attention. That's how he'd been able to operate for so long without getting caught. He started walking toward my position, his footsteps crunching steadily through the snow. I could track his progress by sound even though I couldn't see him in the darkness. He was taking his time, savoring the hunt, confident that I had nowhere to go and no way to escape. I tried to think like a trucker instead of a victim. What advantages did I have in this situation? I knew the terrain from years of driving these routes. I understood how vehicles performed in Arctic conditions, and I had equipment in my truck that might be useful if I could get back to it. The killer was circling around to cut off my retreat route, but he was making a mistake. He was assuming I was an ordinary victim who would panic and make desperate, stupid decisions. But I'd been driving dangerous roads for 15 years. I knew how to stay calm under pressure and think my way out of bad situations. I waited until he was at the furthest point of his circle, then sprinted back toward my truck. The snow was deep enough to muffle my footsteps, and the darkness provided cover as long as I stayed low and moved quickly. I reached the truck just as I heard him realize I was no longer at the rocks. My truck might not start, but it was still full of emergency equipment. Road flares, a tire iron, chains, and most importantly, a 5-gallon can of diesel fuel. If I couldn't escape, maybe I could even the odds. I scattered flares around the truck to create a perimeter of light, making it harder for him to approach without being seen. Then I soaked the ground around the vehicle with diesel fuel and prepared to turn my truck into a trap. If he wanted to get close enough to kill me, he was going to pay a price for it. The killer came back quickly when he realized I'd moved. I could see him now in the glow of the flares, a middle-aged man in heavy winter clothing carrying what looked like a hunting rifle. He stayed at the edge of the light, circling like a predator waiting for an opening. But he made another mistake. He underestimated how much a trucker knows about fire and combustion. When he stepped into the diesel-soaked area, I threw a lit flare at his feet. The fuel ignited instantly, creating a wall of flame between us. The killer stumbled backward, his clothing on fire, dropping his rifle as he rolled in the snow to extinguish the flames. I used those precious seconds to grab the weapon and put the truck between us. That's when I saw something that made everything make sense. The killer's face, illuminated by the firelight, was covered in scars from severe frostbite. Deep, tissue-destroying injuries that had left him permanently disfigured. And his hands were wrong. Several fingers were missing, probably lost to frostbite as well. He wasn't just a serial killer who used Alaska's wilderness as hunting grounds. He was a victim of that wilderness himself, someone who had barely survived exposure to the elements and been psychologically broken by the experience. The cold hadn't just damaged his body, it had damaged his mind. turning him into something that saw other people as enemies to be eliminated. I kept the rifle trained on him as he rolled in the snow, but I could see he was badly burned. The fight was going out of him as shock and hypothermia began to set in. Without proper medical treatment, he survived more than a few hours in sub-zero temperatures. That is when I faced the same moral dilemma that had probably confronted some of his previous victims. I could leave him there to freeze to death, ensuring that he could never kill again. Or I could try to save him, knowing that he could probably escape justice and potentially murder more innocent people. I chose a third option. I used my CB radio to call for help, giving coordinates to both the state troopers and emergency medical services. But I also gathered up all the evidence from his camp, including the journal and the collection of victims' belongings. If he survived, there would be enough evidence to convict him. If he didn't, at least the families of his victims would finally have answers. The killer was unconscious when the rescue helicopter arrived 2 hours later. Severe burns, hypothermia, and blood loss had left him barely clinging to life. He was airlifted to a hospital in Anchorage, where he remained in critical condition for 3 weeks before making a partial recovery. The evidence I collected led to the conviction of Robert Hayes, age 54, for 17 counts of first-degree murder. The journal provided enough details to locate several previously undiscovered crime scenes and return personal effects to victims' families. Hayes is now serving multiple life sentences in a maximum security facility, with no possibility of parole. But the case ISN to really closed for those of us who drive Alaska as remote highways. Because Hayes had been inactive for 20 years, imprisoned for an unrelated crime. That means someone else was responsible for at least 6 disappearances that occurred during his incarceration. Someone who copied his methods so precisely that even experienced investigators assumed it was the same killer. The real red snow murderer might still be out there, driving those empty highways, waiting for the next opportunity to add another splash of crimson to Alaska, this white wilderness. And every time I pass mile 247 on my regular runs, I check my mirrors a little more carefully and make sure my emergency equipment is ready to use. Because in Alaska, you're never really alone on the highway. Someone is always watching from the wilderness, and sometimes they're waiting for you to make that one fatal mistake that turns a routine trip into a journey you'll never complete. The final echoes of Alaska's darkness fade, but the night never ends. If you felt the chill of these stories, don't walk away in silence. Subscribe to Midnight Whispers, ring the bell, and step deeper with us into the unknown. But before you leave, let your voice be heard in the comments. Tell us, where are you listening from tonight? The icy wilderness of the north, the quiet suburbs, or maybe somewhere just as isolated as Alaska itself? Together, we are a circle of listeners scattered across the world, yet bound by the same shadows. Share your place, your thoughts, and your fears. The whispers will always find you.